I'm Milton Bennett. Here is David Trickey. Both of us are consultants and researchers, although for this presentation, I'm taking more of the researcher role and he's taking more of the consultant role. I am associated with the Intercultural Development Research Institute, and what we do is support research, both do and support research in constructivist approaches to intercultural communication. What that means are approaches to intercultural communication that demand a kind of consciousness, that demand that people see themselves as agents, and that's what we mean by constructivist. The research that we do is around how it is that we can develop intercultural competence both in individuals and at the group level, which is what we'll be discussing today, in a way that generates viability, and by that we mean sustainability. Something about TCO?
Yep, no, TCO International is, I'm the partner there responsible for what we call organizational impact. In other words, topics which affect the organization widely and deeply, and we basically focus on how do you get people to think, act, and act consciously, and create value together when the world around us is pretty confusing, complex, and uncertain and unpredictable. So I think that's the similar situation with your field of activity in your industry. And both Milton and I, you know, this is the first time we've been here to this conference, so we're newbies, so it's not unusual that a small number of people are here because you're thinking, who the hell are these guys? But our job, I think, is to come here and bring a combination of both the research side and the practical application in organizations of something that we think is relevant to your industry.
Let me just add that when we started doing this piece of research, which is the measurement of group-level intercultural viability, we had this conference in mind. You know, it's a couple of years ago. You know, we knew this conference was coming, and we have had this as a goal for our research to be able to report to you at least where we are in that research. So while we're newbies to the conference, we're not newbies in thinking about the conference.
No, this is the result of 2 years' work, basically, together. One thing that, I mean, there's a report, an RES Forum report, which is linked to the global mobility sector, and, you know, I want to start with this and potentially end with this. And that's a comment by Nick Jackson, who's the group head of reward at Lloyd's Register in London, who fundamentally says, we absolutely must remember that we exist because the business needs us to. In a VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, this is even more true. However, that means if we fail to support the business in its efforts, we risk losing our relevance. And with that, we fail to gain a seat at the table. So global mobility professionals absolutely must adopt a more commercial and flexible mindset. So I attended a session earlier yesterday on storytelling, which I thought was really good. Again, small group of people attending because there's lots of networking going on outside there. So I think most of you are familiar with a story which is the Three Little Pigs. At least in Western society, the Three Little Pigs story is pretty common for kids. And the idea is that you have these three little pigs that need to survive the big bad wolf, that is going to huff and puff and blow your house down. And one little pig sort of builds a house of straw, and the next one builds a house of sticks, and the last little pig builds a house of brick. And his or she, I'm not quite sure what gender the two little pigs are, builds the house of brick, and he or she is pretty smart. I don't think this fable is relevant anymore in our professional activity. I mean, the building of brick houses as a way of defining our professional identity, I don't think is relevant anymore. And the big bad wolf, quite frankly, is probably exponential change that we are facing in the industry. And the risk is becoming irrelevant. maybe not tomorrow, but soon. So the idea of this session is how can we find an opportunity in the future to reduce our risk of irrelevance and keep the bad wolf away. So the idea is how can we get a seat at the C-suite table? How can we become relevant to senior management in organizations who, quite frankly, even in times of cost-cutting, will be the people who will provide additions to lump sums assigned to global mobility budgets. As most of you are well aware, we have exponential automation, technology, disintermediation. This is Tengai, the robot that next week is starting in Sweden to conduct initial recruitment interviews, selection interviews. And the reason they're using this is there is no unconscious bias with the robot. So there's a good reason to use artificial intelligence. It's actually often better than people. So basically, if something can be automated, it will. I think the other risk, and I've been talking to some people in global mobility over the last day and a half, is the risk of potential commoditizational death spiral, and that basically means that as soon as you get into Me Too products in with your competitors, prices go down. When prices go down, profits go down, and when profits go down, you've got issues of budget, so you decide to reduce costs, and then you spend less on research, and you invest less in research, you invest less in marketing, and therefore new product development goes down, and then you have fewer options, and then it's fundamentally a question of when.
Then you die, right?
So the other thing that we've noticed, I think everyone notices, is that absolutely anything can happen in the geopolitical situation. As a British person, I have been affected by this. I was going to set up a holding company in the UK, but I've been waiting for the last year to understand how the situation with Brexit is going to sort itself out. This obviously affects your ability to plan in your industry and know where streams of people are likely to be moving from and to. And although I think the global mobility industry its fundamental foundation is globalization, what we're noticing is a strong headwind of national territorialization, or a drawing up of the drawbridges of the castle, which is reducing or at least slowing down the process of globalization. There is a risk, I think, of becoming Amazoned in the profession. Talking to Relo talent, or talent Relo outside, the first person to talk to me yesterday basically presented me with a very nice app which would cut out intermediaries pretty damn quickly. And I was thinking, yeah, well, that's really cool. If I were in HR, I would go for that. So the question is, where can we add value? And fundamentally, I think the global mobility industry as a whole needs to reinvent itself. And what Milton and I are here today to do is to think about one particular opportunity which could be part of that reinvention. Now, what are top leadership looking for? Let's go back to what the client needs. This comes from the Predictive Index. This is 2019 CEO benchmarking report. Fundamentally, 4 out of the 5 top challenges for CEOs are related to talent. And the first one there is finding the right talent. Issues like aligning my employees with my strategy, how we can get teams of people to collaborate together, and fundamentally, how we can create a great work environment. These are the kind of issues I think that CEOs are losing sleep over. And if we go closer, perhaps, to global mobility professionals, if we look at the general HR leadership group, this comes from a Gartner study, again, of this year, so it's pretty current. They're asking themselves, how can we build critical skills and competencies for our organization? We'll look at what they might be in a second. We need to strengthen the current and future leadership bench. That's obviously talent issue. And how can we improve the employee experience? Organizations are struggling at the moment to have employees engaged. So the building of critical strategies seems to be around how can we deal with this VUCA environment. So it's not only the global mobility industry that is affected by high-speed, unpredictable change, but most of the organizations that we are serving as not direct suppliers, but indirect suppliers, they're facing this too. So we've experienced more change in the past few years than we ever have before, and so we need our managers more than ever to be able to work in a complex context of ambiguity. The second one is finding, growing, and retaining talent. So 45% of the people in this report reported that their leadership bench lacks diversity. So we've got sameness occurring within leadership teams, and fundamentally both HR and diversity and inclusion want to have more of a focus on creating the conditions for a better place to work. So that's the challenge, if you like, and that is what I think is on the mind of many people in the C-suite. And we think there's good news for the global mobility servicing industry, and that is many DSPs and RMCs, if I'm not wrong, already support individuals in their intercultural development, although this is, in many cases, a kind of add-on or a nice-to-have perceived by the organization. The second thing is that DSPs and RMCs have a lot of expertise in accelerating people's ability to transition around the world and to develop global leadership talent as part of that mix. And global mobility, well, yes, you actually physically move, but when you physically move and you experience new cultural contexts, your actual perceptual experience changes as well. So you develop people from their perceptual perspective. And I think the key thing that I learned, my little kind of moment about 5 years ago, was realizing the clear correlation that existed between the development of people who need to operate successfully internationally, who need to deal with unpredictable situations, unfamiliar situations, ambiguous situations, complex situations, in order to be a successful expat, and the ability, frankly, for everyone else in the organization to do the same. So in other words, the kind of skills that you develop as an expat are the kind of skills that are not exclusively now linked to expats. It's what you expect every employee in the organization to be able to have. So our premise here is intercultural viability, which we'll define in a second, is fundamental to organizational viability. So if you want to sustain your organization, you need to develop intercultural adaptation skills in order to succeed. So viability we see as, this is the dictionary definition. I think the biological one is quite interesting. The ability to continue to exist or develop as a living being and to do that sustainably. So it's less about tactical issues and more about thinking about how we can strategically sustain our organization over the long term. And so we've defined intercultural viability as the probability of the organization to maximize cultural diversity as an asset in the organization. Milton's going to talk a little bit more about this in the future because organizations have access to cultural diversity. The issue is probably they're not actually converting it into an asset. So the kind of challenge that we want to put on the table here, and the provocation, if you like, that we want to make here, is although DSPs and RMCs are focusing on often developing individuals or supporting individuals in their intercultural journey, you've got to make a paradigm shift and move away from dealing with individuals, which you're extremely good at supporting, and then shift that. You've got to move up to thinking about how can we support the whole organization. How can we look at intercultural viability as a key factor in meeting the priorities of top management in the organization? And, well, if CEOs in the C-suite fundamentally need these three things, people who can deal with the VUCA reality at work, how can we attract, retain, develop the kind of talents that we need, and how can we create the workplace conditions where kind of cultural diversity is impacting positively on the bottom line? The fundamental question there is, to what degree is an organization building and measuring a culture which supports intercultural viability with all of its benefits, which include all of these things here? So our idea now is to think about, if we can achieve an organizational nirvana, how do we need to go about it? Because expertise exists within the room and within this conference here. The question we think is just a question of raising our sights a little bit higher and offering a service which focuses on organizational development over and above your individual development, backed up by data, because that will convince more than assumptions or presumptions that this is a good thing. Fundamentally, top teams, I think, are looking for data-driven facts that will support the business case for doing this. So at the moment, we've got no rigorous way to diagnose the degree to which an organization is supporting or building interculturally competent behavior. It does not exist on the planet, at least as much as we know about it. And so we need to focus on two things. The first thing we need to focus, I think, is on coherent theory. We need to have a rigorous theory, and we need to have rigorous ways of measuring intercultural effectiveness in an organization at an organizational level. And that's the last two things that we want to talk about. Milton.
So let me just underline a couple of words that David said. One of them was tactical, the other was strategic. And much of the work of this organization and of the people who are associated with this organization has been tactical. Not just individual, but tactical in the sense of dealing with immediate issues, immediate problems. The shift that we're suggesting is a shift into a more strategic position. Doesn't give up the tactical focus, but it adds to it this more organization-wide sustainability issue. And this is something that you should be able to do well, as David is saying, because the intercultural expertise is already here. Your competitors are the big organization development companies that have added on the intercultural, frequently in a very superficial way. And then they claim to do the intercultural stuff, but they generally don't do it as well as you do. So coming in with the intercultural skill and scaling that up to the strategic level is the idea that we have, and why it is that we're here at this particular conference talking to you about this. So the coherent theory, let me talk a little bit about what it means to have a clear idea of what you're doing and why you're doing it. It seems like an obvious thing to say, but unfortunately, frequently we get so caught up in that tactical level of addressing whatever the immediate client need is that we lose sight of the overall issues. The large issue here is that the globe is not melting. Here is the melting pot idea from the United States, 1927. Israel Zangwill wrote a play called The Melting Pot, which is where that idea comes from. And he was writing about the European immigrants to the U.S., and he said, one of the lines in this play is, "Bring me your many peoples of Europe with their 50 languages and their 50 histories, and we will melt them down in God's crucible, the great melting pot, out of which will emerge a new super race of beings, the Americans." So, yeah. Well, that was picked up, of course, by other groups later in that century. But it was never a good idea, and continues to not be a good idea, despite the fact that that same notion is now making its way into international realms under the term convergence, with the idea that somehow we are converging towards being some similar kind of thing. Well, what kind of similar thing? Well, typically whoever it is that's defining that, frequently it's Harvard Business School, that's saying we're all converging towards being, surprise, like Harvard Business School. Neither of these things, in fact, are capturing the reality of a situation, which is that in the 21st century, as David mentioned earlier, everybody is going to have access to cultural diversity. This is Rosabeth Moss-Kanter from Harvard Business School, one of the people who tends not to do the convergence business. And the issue is going to be not who has access to cultural diversity. The issue is going to be who can turn that access into an asset. So the important thing here is to make diversity, which is there anyway, an asset. And that's what you can do strategically at the organizational level. That's what we're suggesting here. There's some interesting research to support that last assertion, which is the diversity is there anyway. The assumption of global convergence is in fact counteracted by the fact that is supported by a lot of research that when you bring people who are different together, they accentuate their differences, they emphasize their differences, they don't give them up. There's a study from Geert Hofstede, who's known, I suppose, to many of you for his work on cultural differences, but his original research was actually trying to test this convergence hypothesis. His idea was that if you looked at a lot of people who were working in a strong corporate culture, in this case IBM, from different national groups, that they would look more similar to one another than their compatriots who weren't working for that big corporation. And so he tested people from 31 different national groups within IBM on a little cultural questionnaire and compared them to their compatriots from those same 31 national groups outside of IBM. And he found the opposite of what he expected. He found that the people outside of IBM were less different, were more similar to one another than the people inside IBM who were reporting themselves to be rather different from one another compared to their compatriots outside. And what this has done is to pretty much support the original statement of Global Village from Marshall McLuhan, which is, in the global village, we're not all going to be the same. Our neighbors are going to be profoundly different from us. The important word here is neighbors. We've always been profoundly different from one another, but we just weren't neighbors. We didn't pick up the phone and talk to each other. We weren't engaged in the kind of mobility which we're now engaged in, which makes this difference neighborly. Here's another little piece of research that's kind of interesting about the inevitability of diversity. This one has to do with teams. And this is, again, one of those strategic issues which is of interest to the C-suite. At least I've presented this to lots of executives, and pretty much 100% have said, oh, this is a pretty important issue. This is a compendium of a number of different research efforts that were looking at the difference between monocultural teams that largely were similar in cultural terms, with multicultural teams. And the way it works is that you give the monocultural team a task, usually some kind of creative task, like how many ways can you use a brick? And then you compare their result, which you name as average, like they have 7, for instance, that's average. And then you create the multicultural team. So you mix up nationality, ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, whatever kinds of diversity you can bring into the team. You make those teams multicultural, and you give them the same task. And you compare how they do that task to the monocultural team. The multicultural teams either outperform or underperform the monocultural teams. So the dirty secret here is that multicultural teams are not necessarily better than monocultural teams at creative tasks. Sometimes they're worse. What makes them better? What do you think? They're more likely to understand one another and particularly to understand their differences. Yeah, what else? What's more? They have different views. Yeah, but both of those teams, assumedly they both have access to different views. But somehow this team is turning the access into an asset in the task. Yeah. Right. Yep. These people are better coordinated around their differences. They're able to use those differences somehow in pursuit of the task, as opposed to those folks there that assumedly still have the differences, but they're not able to use them. Why? Who's responsible, for the most part, in helping to coordinate the communication in a team? Yeah, but everyone, yes, but as we know from other research, multicultural teams do not operate well without strong leaders. That more than other teams, emergent leadership, which you can get by with in certain homogeneous teams, in multicultural teams, emergent leadership does not work as well as assigned leadership, and particularly assigned leadership where the leader acknowledges and supports cultural difference. And if that's the case, the cultural difference is more likely to become an asset to performance. If, as in many cases, as is the case in many times, the leader ignores or suppresses the cultural difference, typically in the name of the corporate culture, meaning we're all IBM here, let's just get to the task. The differences don't go away, they just become obstacles to performance. So here's what we think is going on, and what we're doing is making the case for the strategic importance of leadership. That if you bring leadership to the issue of cultural diversity, you're more likely to attain that position that Rosa Beth Moss-Cantor is suggesting of turning access into an asset. Here's another piece of research, also from Harvard Business School. This is based on the Leadership Initiative database where 1,300 innovative business leaders were interviewed. I looked at the criteria and they were pretty good for these innovative business leaders. They were not just from the US. They weren't just people who weren't in jail. There are other good criteria. No personality characteristics in common. This is, of course, bad news for the people who want to sell books at the airport. But in fact, every study of leadership does not show, there is no study that consistently shows a personality, a leader personality. There is, however, a widespread ability to identify trends, and most importantly for us, the shared ability to recognize context, shift context, and synthesize across contexts. In fact, exactly what David was mentioning earlier as what CEOs are looking for in talent. And it turns out that that skill, as he was suggesting, is not just a skill of intercultural communication, it's a skill that allows people to deal with complex organizational issues of all kinds. As some of you may know, the primary theoretical position that I've been working on for the last 30 plus years is this developmental idea. This is the perceptual experience of difference, and this is based on the idea that people can get better at perceiving differences. And when they do that, when they get better at perceiving differences, they are more able to manage those differences in ways that turn the access into an asset. In other words, they become better leaders in multicultural situations. Now, briefly, this movement goes from an ethnocentric to an ethno-relative position, where ethnocentric means experiencing your culture as if it's the real thing, and everything else is kind of unreal. Versus ethno-relative, where you see the reality that you live in as not less real, but that you acknowledge that other people are living in equally real but different realities. And it's that acknowledgement that allows you to be one of those green teams rather than one of the red teams. You know, it's the acknowledgement of the reality of the other, and thus the willingness to coordinate with the other to the end of the task. The movement through here is briefly from denial of the importance of culture, and this is when you go in and talk to a client who says, we don't care about cultural differences, we make computer chips. And computer chips don't care what culture they're in, so just give us the logistics, but don't tell us anything about culture because it's not relevant to the work that we do. Now, most of you know this is a specious argument, but nevertheless one that comes from the position here of not being able to construe or not being able to perceive cultural differences. This, as that gives way under the weight of being exposed to cultural differences, it turns into defense. Defense in this case meaning a polarization of us and them, where you see that yes, indeed, other people do exist, but you see them in simplistic, stereotypical terms, frequently in negative terms. This is, of course, what we're seeing socially in terms of anti-immigration, but we see forms of this in the organization as well, generally somewhat milder forms. Minimization has typically been the goal of a lot of prejudice reduction work, where we say what we need to do is just recognize that we're all human. Yeah, but human like who? Human like her, human like me, human like her. And unfortunately, the answer to that usually is an unconscious assumption that everybody else is like me. It's particularly true if the person who's making the statement is from some kind of dominant group. In some cases, that means white males, but in other cases, it may be some other kind of dominant group, dominant meaning the people who make the rules. But in any case, the assumption of minimization is typically the assumption that other people are like you. It's an improvement over defense because you're less likely to kill those people. On the other hand, it doesn't improve access or turning access into an asset for diversity. That occurs mainly at acceptance, where we're able to attribute equal human complexity to alternative groups. This is where we can humanize the other and say, yes, other people are equally human, but part of that humanity is they're different from us. They're living in different cultural realities. That sets up the ability to adapt to that difference, and here's the key. The key is adaptation. The key is increasing our repertoire of behavior. Adaptation doesn't mean giving up who you are. It means increasing the options that you have for being able to act in different ways. And this is the key behavior that allows for people in organizations to not only be better at intercultural issues, but to be better at all of the other issues that David was mentioning earlier. Integration means incorporating that into the habitual way that we do things. In other words, it's the way we do things around here is by engaging in this kind of mutual adaptation, where yes, we're adapting to you, you're adapting to us, and every situation that we go into is one where we're acknowledging the cultural differences and saying, how can we adapt to one another in such a way as to maximize the value of these differences for the task at hand, whatever that might be. When that becomes the way we do things around here, it represents integration in this model here. That's the theory. So, what we'd like to do is to see what does this look like at an organizational level. We have a pretty good idea of what it looks like individually, a lot of research to support that. But what does it look like at an organizational level? And so here are some of the implications that we are exploring. Leaders at Denial tend to not recognize international issues at all. They tend to engage in this kind of social Darwinism, which means that they see that they are the top dogs in the pack, and the reason for that is they're more fit. They're the strongest in the situation. Poor people are poor because they deserve to be poor, and rich people are rich because they deserve to be rich. It's kind of a self-sealing premise, and that comes out of this denial position here. And under threat, then, leaders tend to, whether they be social leaders or political leaders or organizational leaders, engage in these kind of pogroms. And now a pogrom in the social level may look like ethnic cleansing or genocide, but in the organization, a pogrom looks like, let's get rid of all the dead wood. Let's get rid of all the people who are not doing what we think they should be doing, and what we're left with then are the people who are familiar to us, the people who are more or less like us. Pogroms tend to generate homogeneity. In other words, they move in exactly the opposite direction. At defense, we have the poisoning of relationships, a lot of neo-colonialist activity. One more thing here, sort of this idea that we're the model. This is the Harvard Business School, the negative aspects of that, which is, we're the model for everybody in the world. Sorry to be picking on Harvard Business School. I do use and appreciate their research. Yeah, the minimization of difference, and this is pretty interesting here, because here the tolerance, so we become tolerant, but we mistake that for being interculturally sensitive. But in fact, you're not interculturally sensitive, you're just tolerant. I used to give a speech about that. At least they have a bucket there. So I used to give a speech about that and say it's like being married. First of all, you have to realize that the people that you marry are selected to be different from yourself. Did you know that? I mean, even if you're in a same-sex marriage or same-sex partnership, you select the people to be partners with on the basis of difference rather than similarity, unlike your friends that you select on the basis of similarity. So, therefore, the way that you treat your friends doesn't work with your partner. You may have noticed that. Yeah. yeah. So, and one of the things that doesn't work with your partner is to turn to her or him, at the end of 10 years and say, honey, it's been a great 10 years. I've come to tolerate you. This is definitely not an adequate response, and yet here we are, more or less married to one another in this kind of multicultural world that we've created for ourselves. Cultural privilege is a big problem in this case too, meaning that people who are from the dominant group tend to see themselves as naturally in that group, naturally making the rules, as opposed to recognize that that's a privilege of circumstance. As we move to acceptance, we see that cultural difference is then perceived as more of a valuable asset, as we mentioned before. Disagreements are approached by allowing difference to exist. Cultural perspective is acknowledged rather than presented as the true way of doing things. Adaptation rather than assimilation is sought. Multicultural societies are perceived as more creative. Cooperative competition. What that last one means is that rather than saying, let's kill the competition, you say, how do we create an ecology? How do we create an environment where we can all survive in a way that generates added value? It's an ecological competition, which most people who study sustainability say to make competitive situations work, you need to look at the larger system in which you're not trying to kill your competition, you're trying to outperform your competition. Finally, integration social institutions are constructed to support this mutual adaptation. Intercultural competence is seen as a crucial skill, and our common interest is in surviving and thriving in this environment. So those are the kinds of behaviors that we believe that we are going to be able to measure, and we have some now support for being able to do that.
Thanks, Milton. So that's the theory, and what we have spent the last couple of years doing is trying to develop something that nobody has developed for, which is an instrument to be able to measure at an organizational level intercultural effectiveness at a group level rather than at an individual level. So we've developed a diagnostic tool. It's in early phases of development still, but we do have research now from 4 organizations, multinational organizations, so we can compare those organizations. And what we do is we assess the assessor's perspective first, in the sense that we do a very quick check on those 6 stages of intercultural development, how the person who is completing the questionnaire, who is looking around the organization at interculturally varied sensitive behavior, how the observer's gaze actually can affect what they can see. So it's kind of complex in terms of 2 things we're trying to do here. So I'm really interested in getting measurable data to be able to prove and show the organization how it's behaving. I had a CEO recently who said, well, fundamentally, you know, we have a kind of diversity policy, and we have nice posters around the organization which say we value cultural diversity, and they're very colorful and they look very nice. And, you know, I think generally speaking, people here are respectful towards other cultures. And the guy was in the pharmaceutical industry, for goodness sake. So I said, you know, well, do you have measurement for that? And he said, no, but, you know, I got a hunch, so we won't focus on that. And I said, well, you know, if you were offering a drug to the FDA, quite frankly, you would need a little bit more data than that to prove that hunch. So, you know, I think, you know, the intercultural area has a little bit of physics envy sometimes, and I think we need to be able to bring data. And that's why we focused on this, because also this is where things are going. This is the McKinsey report, April, last month, about why you should apply analytics to your people strategy. This is where I see HR moving towards data analytics, and we need to be able to get better people metrics in order to be credible in this whole idea that we're putting forward to. Okay, so what can we do? Well, we can kind of sort of say, well, what's the mindset in the organization? I think, you know, how many times do you hear the expression global mindset? Mm-hmm. Occasionally? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Do you have one? Mm-hmm. I hope so. I would not know what it looks like if it hit me in the face, because a global mindset is internal. The only thing that we can measure in organizations is people's behavior. We have to focus on behaviors. So behaviors are fundamentally observable. There are things that people do and things that people say that we can see and we can notice and we can measure, because you cannot measure a mindset. So if we measure observable behaviors, then we're going to get a picture of how things are done around here, which is fundamentally the culture. Through behavioral observation of what other people in the organization are doing, we can create a picture of the organization's ability to be interculturally viable or not. So that's the challenge that we had, and what we have done is to develop a tool which fundamentally asks someone to answer this question. You know, what do you notice in the way that people behave around you in the organization regarding culture and cultural diversity? So what are you noticing in your peer-to-peer networks around you? And then what we're doing is offering that questionnaire to different people in the organization who have different lines of sight in the organization in order to cover the whole organization. And what we've done is, apart from focusing on a self-assessment, in other words, how do you see yourself according to those 6 stages of development, but how do you see your colleagues around you in meetings, when they're writing things, when you get emails from them, when you have a chat around the coffee machine, when you're involved in a teleconference or a video conference, if you have to give somebody feedback. You know, if you're visiting people from another cultural group, or you're hosting people from another country, or if you have problems, linguistic problems of not having a shared language, how do you manage that? These are really practical situations, and what we've attempted to do is to define behaviorally in each of those situations what you would expect people to be doing at those 6 stages of intercultural development. And maybe, Milton, you can just talk us through one item. We'll just give you one item as an example.
Okay, here's the item. In scheduled face-to-face meetings, I noticed that people in the organization. Now, the I up there, we're able to assess at what level of development this perception is coming from. So we have a sense of the lens of the perceiver as well as what he or she is perceiving in the organization. And at denial, I immediately approach the task People around me immediately approach the task in established business-like ways. Defense, we attempt to reduce cultural problems. In other words, culture is seen as a problem that needs to be reduced. That's a defense position. At minimization, we say, well, we just talk about our similarities and we move forward. We don't have to worry about these differences. At acceptance, then, we actually stop and discuss what these differences are and how they might be valuable to us. At adaptation, we can give you examples of how we change our behavior to make use of this diversity. And at integration, we talk about how this is a habitual or normal way of doing things around here. These observations can be made reliably, but it depends on the perceiver. So here's what the research looks like so far. First of all, the aggregate of individuals does not equal the group. And this is really important because all of the measurements that we have essentially are individual measurements. And so when we talk about groups, what we do is we just sum up those individual or average those individual things and say, okay, that's the group, but it's not. And we have good evidence to show that in this research, but although that's been shown in lots of other research as well. So we need to be looking somehow at the group, but also in terms of the individual perception. So here, the behaviors, what the C's depend on the observer's own intercultural sensitivity to notice those behaviors. Specifically, so what we do then is we ask the individuals to rate themselves in terms of these 6 stages. Those of you who know the previous measurement called the Intercultural Development Inventory know that we can do that with 50 items. Turns out you can do that with 1 item. That, just by asking people a question and having 6 responses to it, we're able to assess reliably the person's own position of sensitivity. Now with that, we've discovered some interesting things. Living abroad by itself does not correlate with greater intercultural sensitivity. It reduces ethnocentric behavior, but it doesn't increase ethno-relative behavior. So if somebody has, quote, international experience, usually what that means is that they can engage in certain kinds of minimization, but that's about it. They're not able to engage in acceptance, adaptation, or support integration. What we in fact are able to see is that if you've received intercultural training, this is the result of this research that we've just been doing now. If you receive intercultural training, it both reduces the ethnocentric and increases the ethno-relative. So this is new support, behavioral support, support at the group level as well as at the individual level for the importance of intercultural training, and what's called in the study abroad business as intervention. That things don't happen accidentally. You can't send students abroad and have them accidentally become more interculturally sensitive. It demands intervention, and this is also true, of course, for all the mobility work. Further, when we control for the perception of the individual and have them look at behaviors in the organization, what we're seeing is a lack of coherence in the behavior in the organization. We're seeing the behavior is all over the place in the organization. We are not seeing clumps of coherent behavior at the acceptance, adaptation, or integration level. And we think that's probably pretty interesting. Part of that is the role of the observer, but a good part of that is that behavior is just not being exhibited in a coherent way in the organization, which we think gives us the opportunity of saying, now with some research support, you can improve the coherence of the behavior in the organization, and in so doing, you can turn the activity of the organization from a flashlight into a laser. A laser light is literally coherent light, and it shines a very narrow beam, but it's very bright, as opposed to a flashlight, which is incoherent light, which makes a wide beam, but it's not very bright. Most organizations would like to be laser-like in their focus. That's true for you, true for your clients. They want to be laser-like, but to be laser-like, they need to have coherence. And if they want to be laser-like in their ability to deal effectively with cultural difference, they need to have coherent behavior that supports that. So this is what's coming out of our research so far. The correlation between people who have higher levels of sensitivity means that the people with higher levels of intercultural sensitivity are able to more reliably see the ethno-relative behavior in the organization. So if you want people, leaders, to recognize ethno-relative behavior in the group and to support that in the multicultural group, those leaders need themselves to be more interculturally sensitive. That's what our research is supporting. So, just to sum up the leadership issue here, leadership is indeed the place to start, that there are specific behaviors that support intercultural viability. This is sustainable ability to deal with cultural difference effectively. We can identify this, we can model the appropriate leadership that's necessary, we can recognize that behavior in other people, and we can spread it various ways. Viral change is one form. There are other forms of using critical mass techniques to spread this throughout an organization. There are, in fact, ethnocentric behaviors that undermine the viability in the workplace. These also can be identified, and efforts can be made to reduce the influence of those behaviors.
So, implications of all of this. What we hope to be able to do is to ensure that an organization has a specific and reliable and rigorous measurement of its capacity to maximize cultural diversity in the organization. And as we said, if you've got cultural diversity in the organization, which is an asset, you have ability to innovate, to have people who are more creative, able to manage uncertainty, to manage change, do all the things that is the nirvana of most top management. But often the intercultural aspect has been a nice to have and not a central area. So we want to try and bring it back center stage. We're interested in working with a few organizations on our kind of phase 2, and phase 2 will be doing full diagnosis of organizations. We've looked at a division within 4 organizations. We'd like to look at whole organizations and provide them with feedback on the data. And then obviously we want to go to the area of intervention. But basically, this is providing strategic consulting for the organization in order to move its workforce to be more effective in the future, in order to be sustainable and creative and able to deal with the uncertainties of the future. So what are the steps? How do you get to the C-suite table? So we've got the RMCs, the DSPs, the intercultural training organizations there. They probably need to talk to each other. Somebody is talking to global mobility in the organization. What we're finding is global mobility also need to step up. They also need to find greater relevance. They also need to be more joined up and more integrated with other parts of the HR community, like, for example, talent and talent management and talent development, like rewards and compensation, like diversity and inclusion within HR, and like people involved in organizational development. And so, frankly, global mobility, you can help global mobility also to become more relevant and more interconnected within the whole organization. And then, well, the idea here is they and you will help them to make the business case to move towards the chief HR officer, for example, the head of HR in the organization, who will then have access to the C-suite. So basically, it's not a simple journey. It's not as if you basically say, okay, can I just talk to you, Mr. CEO, about how to do this in the organization? But you get people involved in the dialogue. You have a more sophisticated, well-qualified, data-based discussion with the organization who will take you more seriously and take the intercultural factor more seriously, and you'll bind them up together with the other parts of the business so that the business case can then be presented with the facts and with the data. So basically, the first thing to do is to create the business case for intercultural viability.
Let me say something briefly about that. The business case for intercultural viability needs to be clearly not the flavor of the month, because this is what kills most initiatives in organizations, is they're perceived as flavor of the month, and if anything's done, it's done on a very, very tentative basis, which is insufficient to meet the criteria that David is suggesting here. And the way that you keep from being flavor of the month is coming in with a strong theoretical position. That the coherent, as we say in the IDR Institute, coherent theory drives powerful practice. So by coming in with a coherent theory, you're able to say, we have a theory, we can measure it, and this is what we are suggesting that you do, as opposed to, here's something that might be interesting.
Secondly, you'll need to build some alliances, maybe with RMCs, with global mobility, have conversations with talent, but that gives you greater exposure to other parts of the business and other stakeholders as well. So maybe amongst the service providers, certainly with global mobility, and through global mobility to other HR functions. And basically, the whole of this process is an attempt to create a rising tide that raises all boats. It raises your visibility and your ability to provide strategic solutions and not only tactical solutions. It raises the profile of the global mobility professional in the organization who needs to become more relevant. And it deals with the organizational challenge, which we go back to where we were at the beginning, which is we exist because the business needs us. If those are the business challenges, this is the way that we can meet those business challenges and we can increase our relevance in the future. 12:30. Okay, great.
All right.
So we've tsunami of stuff and ideas and thoughts and aspirations, and I think a little bit of dreaming here about what could be done. But we'd be interested if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, challenges, or encouragement.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.